My name is Norma J. Brick, and August the 3rd was supposed to be the day everything finally made sense. The venue was perfect in a way that felt unreal, soft jazz humming through the speakers, warm lighting, catching on glass and linen, 43 guests seated and smiling like witnesses to something sacred. I stood there next to Daniel, the man I was about to marry, thinking that for once in my life I had earned a moment that didn't require sacrifice. I had worked for years to get here. Consulting contracts that paid in exposure instead of money, red-eye flights, sleeping in terminals, saying yes to opportunities that left me drained but moving forward. I had built myself piece by piece, quietly, without asking anyone to carry me. My sister Bethany had watched all of that from the sidelines. She arrived late, which should have been my first warning. The ceremony was already over when she walked in, wearing a gold backless dress that looked more suited for a nightclub than a wedding. She didn't smile, didn't congratulate us, didn't even acknowledge me. She grabbed a glass of champagne and positioned herself in a corner like she was waiting for something to happen. When our eyes met briefly, she looked through me as if I were a stranger. Anyone else might have called it moodiness. I knew better. That silence was always the prelude. 3 weeks earlier, she had called me sobbing about her car breaking down again. I had already given her $1,200 in April for repairs. This time, she said she needed a new one, that it was urgent, that she couldn't function without help. I told her no. Not because I didn't have the money, but because I was tired of being her emergency plan. Tired of skipped classes, half-truths, and the way every crisis somehow landed in my lap. She hung up on me without saying goodbye. I assumed she would cool off. I always assumed that. I didn't think she'd bring it to my wedding. When it came time for the toast, I stood up, glass in hand, heart full in that fragile way happiness can be when you don't guard it. I started thanking everyone for coming, talking about love, about choosing someone who brings peace into your life. Bethany stood up too. For half a second, I thought she might be joining me. My glass was still halfway to my mouth when she threw hers. The champagne arced through the air and exploded against the dessert table, shattering a framed photo of Daniel and me, smiling on a cliff in Maui. Then she lunged for the cake and shoved it hard, like she was flipping furniture. 3 tears collapsed in on themselves, sugar flowers crushed into frosting and carpet. The room went silent. So silent I could hear someone's phone vibrating. Bethany looked straight at me and screamed, loud enough for people outside to hear, "This is what you get for acting like you're better." No one moved. My mother rushed to her like she'd been attacked, wrapping her arms around Bethany and telling everyone she just needed to let it out. Daniel's parents stared at me in disbelief. The DJ cut the music. Bethany didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She walked out like she had proven a point. I didn't say a word. Not because I was stunned, but because I knew this wasn't the place. I wasn't going to let her turn my wedding into her courtroom. I smiled, whispered something calming to Daniel, and nodded to the coordinator. The rest of the night limped forward, people dancing out of obligation, pretending the moment hadn't already burned itself into memory. At home that night, while Daniel changed out of his suit, I opened my laptop. I didn't cry. I did not vent. I logged into the university portal and revoked the tuition deposit I had paid for Bethany the month before. $9,400 disappeared with one click. Then I accessed the rental portal for the apartment lease I had co-signed. I locked the account, marked it for review, and froze payment authorization. Rent was due in 5 days. At exactly 8:40 the next morning, Bethany called. I didn't answer. By the time the sun came up, my phone had already started vibrating itself off the nightstand. Missed calls first, then texts, then voice memos that got sharper with each one. The early messages were confused, almost polite. Why can't I access the portal? The rent page is locked. Did something glitch? By the 6th message, the confusion was gone. Fix this. That was all it said. No hello, no apology, just expectation, wrapped in authority she didn't actually have. I muted the thread and made coffee. I didn't feel triumphant or cruel. I felt quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you finally stop bracing for impact. Daniel watched me from the kitchen doorway and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, and for the first time, I meant it. He didn't ask what I'd done. He didn't need to. He kissed my forehead and went back to unpacking wedding gifts like the night before, hadn't detonated in front of 43 people. Around noon, my mother called. I let it ring out. She left a voicemail telling me Bethany was very upset and felt abandoned, asking me to call her back. The word abandoned sat there like a joke with bad timing. Bethany hadn't felt abandoned when I covered her overdraft fees, or bailed her out of a botched vacation rental, or sent $500 just until Friday that turned into 4 weeks of silence. No one called me then to ask how I felt. Bethany didn't speak to me for 2 days after the wedding. Then she showed up at our apartment. Daniel saw her through the peephole first and didn't open the door. Bethany knocked anyway, loud and rhythmic, like she was trying to start a confrontation through sound alone. When Daniel finally cracked the door, Bethany didn't greet him. She went straight into demands. She said she had 5 days to pay rent, that she'd already burned through her summer job money, that she was counting on the tuition deposit to cover expenses. She told him I had no right to pull anything, that I had a moral obligation to follow through. Daniel told her I wasn't home. That was a lie. I was sitting on the couch 10 feet away, listening, waiting for something I hadn't heard yet. Remorse, accountability, anything that sounded like she understood what she'd done. It never came. She left shouting about legal rights and threats she didn't understand. She was wrong. I was the primary on the lease. She was a resident. I had checked. I had power, and I had used it. 3 days passed. She emailed me with a subject line that felt performative. "Are you seriously doing this?" Inside was a detailed breakdown of her expenses, numbers laid out like evidence in a case she assumed she'd already won. She said if I didn't reinstate the tuition, she'd have to drop out for the semester. If she got evicted, it would be on me. Then she pivoted, saying she'd acted out at the wedding because she was overwhelmed, that I should have understood I was the only person in the family with real money and that it had gone to my head. I didn't reply. I forwarded the email to Daniel with a note that said, "Your turn to read the circus." That's when she escalated. She showed up again, this time waiting until Daniel came home from work and trying to slip in behind him through the door. Daniel didn't yell. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm, pulled her into the hallway, and told her if she ever tried that again, he'd call the police. When she kept pushing, he grabbed a fistful of her hair and shoved her down the hall. Not dramatic, not loud, just decisive. Then he shut the door and locked it like he'd taken out the trash. 10 minutes later, my phone lit up again. This time it was my father. He sighed into the receiver and said we needed to talk about my sister. He said she was spiraling, that what she did at the wedding was just emotions, that I shouldn't take it personally, that I was old enough to be the bigger person. I told him I'd already done that for years. He said I was punishing her for a bad moment. I told him it wasn't a moment, it was a pattern. I hung up when he started talking about family unity. That was when it hit me. Bethany wasn't spiraling, she was just finally falling. After Daniel closed the door, we didn't talk right away. We sat on the couch with a glass of wine like nothing had happened. It wasn't awkward. It felt settled, like a line had been drawn in permanent ink. Bethany didn't come back the next day, but she didn't disappear either. She started texting Daniel instead of me. Apologies wrapped in guilt, paragraphs pretending to be mature, but always ending with the same phrase in different clothes. He owes me. Daniel blocked her. Then she told my parents that she'd been physically attacked and treated like a stray dog. She made it sound like she'd come to reconcile and been ambushed. That's when the group chat happened. My father added everyone and typed that we needed an honest talk without yelling or blocking because we were still a family. Bethany went first, saying she felt invisible, that she'd acted out because she wanted someone to acknowledge how forgotten she felt. She said I'd been rubbing my success in her face for years. My mother followed, saying it was time to forgive her while she was still finding herself. She ended with, "She's still your baby sister." Daniel left the group chat. I stared at the screen for a long time, then typed 3 sentences. She's not a baby. She's 22, and she needs to learn the cost of disrespect. No one replied. 2 days later, my cousin told me Bethany had packed up and left her apartment. She couldn't pay rent. She couldn't find a subletter. The leasing company contacted me for final paperwork. I signed it, protected my credit, and moved on. A week later, the final punch landed. Bethany enrolled back in school under my parents' name. They paid the tuition themselves. Quietly, no announcement, no apology. They had the money all along. They just didn't want to use it until I refused to. And in that moment, I wasn't angry. I was done. The quiet that followed felt unnatural, like the pause after something breaks but before the noise finishes echoing. I thought maybe this was the part where everyone would cool off, where time would soften the edges and force a reset. Instead, Bethany found new ways to be loud. She didn't come back to our apartment, but she didn't retreat either. She started sending messages to Daniel through different numbers, apologizing one minute and accusing the next, each paragraph carefully constructed to sound reasonable, while still insisting that I owed her something. When he blocked those two, she pivoted again, this time straight into performance mode. She told our parents she'd been mistreated, that Daniel had attacked her, that she was afraid. She left out the part where she tried to force her way into our home, where she refused to leave, where she assumed access was still hers by default. My parents didn't ask questions. They didn't request details. They reacted the way they always had, by circling around her and turning their disappointment outward. My father called again, calmer this time, his voice carrying that familiar tone of negotiation. He said Bethany was struggling, that she felt pushed out, that I needed to help her land. He said what she did at the wedding was just emotions spilling over, that I shouldn't take it so personally. I told him it had been personal when she shattered my cake and screamed in front of my guests. He sighed like I was being difficult and said I needed to let things go for the sake of family. That word kept coming up, family, as if it were a shield that excused everything. Bethany leaned into the narrative hard. She started telling extended relatives that she'd been cut off without warning, that I had abandoned her when she needed help the most. She framed herself as the younger sibling overshadowed by success, the one who never measured up. I heard about it through cousins and old family friends, the same phrases repeating like lines from a script. She was finding her voice, they said. She was finally standing up for herself. I watched it happen from a distance, no longer surprised by how easily people accepted her version. She had always been good at that, at shaping a story that made her look wounded and brave at the same time. What stung wasn't that people believed her, it was that my parents helped her do it. Then came the birthday invitation. My mother called and spoke like nothing had happened, asking if we'd be at my father's birthday the following Saturday. She mentioned Bethany would be there and said she wanted us to talk like adults and stop being so cold. Cold. The word hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't the one who'd made a scene at a wedding, or tried to force entry into someone else's home. I was the one who finally said no. I told her I wasn't sure. She paused, then said she hoped I'd reconsider, that family events weren't the place for grudges. I hung up without committing to anything. Friday night, the day before the party, Bethany sent me a Venmo request. $1,800. The note read, "For the cake and broken frame. LOL. Let's just call it even." I stared at my phone, then handed it to Daniel and stepped onto the balcony to breathe. When I came back in, he looked calm in a way that made me uneasy. I asked what he'd replied. He shrugged and said she wasn't going to like it. She blocked us both 15 minutes later. We didn't go to the birthday party. Bethany did. She showed up in a white jumpsuit that looked uncomfortably close to bridal wear and brought a man she'd met 2 weeks earlier. She told half the guests they were moving in together. The other half, she told big things were coming. Big things. She said it like a mantra. My cousin texted me a photo with a caption that said, "She's not okay." The following Monday, I found out what the big thing was. Bethany launched a podcast. The title dropped online that afternoon, dramatic and carefully chosen, something about bloodlines and bruises, about growing up with a golden child. The teaser video featured her voice, layered over soft music, talking about family betrayal and emotional neglect. She thanked a therapy app at the end, the same one I'd recommended to her a year earlier when she'd called me crying from a bathroom at a bar. They reposted her video. It pulled thousands of views in a day. Comments poured in calling her brave, telling her they related, asking for advice. I didn't listen to the episode. I didn't need to. The feeling it left behind was enough, like being written into someone else's fiction without consent. That night, she emailed me. The subject line read, "Let's talk." The body was short and unnervingly calm. She said she'd like to meet, no drama, just a conversation. She said she had things she wanted to tell me and that she thought I'd be proud of her. No accusations, no demands. It didn't sound like her at all. Daniel read it twice and said she wasn't trying to fix anything. She was setting a trap. I replied with one line, "Daniel will be there too." She never wrote back. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't finished. People like Bethany didn't let go when the spotlight dimmed. They just found a new angle, And sure enough, 3 days later, my parents rang our doorbell at 7:15 p.m. Without calling first, my mother already dressed like she planned to stay. I opened the door halfway and didn't invite them in. My father gave a small wave like this was a casual visit, like they hadn't watched my wedding implode and then blamed me for refusing to clean up afterward. My mother stepped forward first, purse already on her shoulder, eyes scanning the apartment as if she'd rehearsed what she wanted to say. I told them they had 3 minutes. They walked in anyway. Daniel stayed in the kitchen, arms crossed, silent and immovable. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was the line. My mother started talking immediately, voice measured, careful, the way people speak when they think tone can replace accountability. She said Bethany was going through a transformative period and had made mistakes she deeply regretted. She said the podcast was just her way of processing, that I shouldn't take it so personally. My father added that Bethany wanted a relationship with me and just didn't know how to say it. He said families heal when people meet each other halfway. I asked if Bethany had actually said any of that, or if they were hoping I'd accept it because it sounded reasonable. They didn't answer. My mother shifted her weight and said Bethany had moved back in with them temporarily, just until she figured things out. That was the moment the whole picture snapped into focus. They had paid her tuition. They had let her move back home, and now they were here, not to ask me for anything, but to make sure I didn't make things harder for her. They weren't mediating, they were managing. I asked them directly whether either of them had told Bethany that what she did at my wedding was wrong. My mother said she was overwhelmed. My father said she didn't mean to ruin it. I asked again, slower this time, whether anyone had told her it was wrong. The silence answered for them. They weren't angry at her, they were embarrassed. And embarrassment was easier to redirect than accountability. I told them I was done with the money, the guilt, and the expectation that I would always be the one to absorb the damage. I told them they had raised a daughter who believed consequences were optional because someone else would always pay. I asked them to leave. They hesitated, then did, my mother looking back like she expected me to change my mind before the door closed. I didn't. Bethany didn't contact me after that, but the podcast kept going. Episode 2 framed me as emotionally unavailable. Episode 3 was titled, Something About Being Made to Look Crazy. Daniel and I laughed at that one, not because it was funny, but because the script was getting predictable. A few days later, I checked the lease on our apartment, counted the months left, ran the numbers, and told Daniel we should take a trip. Somewhere far. Somewhere warm. Somewhere that didn't know our names. We booked flights without overthinking it. 6 weeks out. No family, no drama, just space. 2 days before we left, Bethany sent one last message, a fire emoji. No words, no context, like a warning or a reminder that she was still watching. I showed Daniel while we were picking up luggage tags. He scanned his boarding pass and said, "Perfect, let it burn." I blocked her number. The silence afterward was complete. My father didn't call. My mother sent one generic text wishing us well that I ignored. I think they finally understood that I wasn't going to be the one to fix what they refused to face. We left on a Thursday morning, no rush, no guilt, just the quiet hum of the plane lifting us out of the noise. I watched Daniel fall asleep against the window as we crossed miles of open water, and for the first time in years, my mind wasn't racing ahead to the next crisis. Our bungalow sat over the water, the ocean audible through the floorboards. Inside was a small sign that read, "No clocks. Let time be yours again." We didn't talk about Bethany, not once. On the 4th morning, over breakfast on the deck, Daniel asked if I thought they would ever admit it. I didn't need to ask who he meant. I said no, but I believed they knew, in the way people know when their favorite scapegoat finally walks away. Bethany stayed with them. Her lease expired quietly. The building relisted the unit without a problem. She never reached out to explain or apologize. She never would. The podcast sputtered out after a few more episodes. Engagement slowed. Sponsorships vanished. The noise faded. When we came home, we moved to a better place, further from the city, closer to quiet. I closed old accounts, changed passwords, and stopped co-signing my future to anyone else's chaos. Some nights we sit on the porch with wine and watch a neighbor's dog chase moths under the light. We talk about real things, plans, ideas, peace. The wedding feels like a story that happened to someone else. Sometimes fire doesn't need to be fought. Sometimes you let it burn itself out and walk away, finally warm. When we came back from the trip, the city felt louder than I remembered, like we'd stepped back into a version of life that no longer fit. The apartment we'd left behind was already half a memory, boxes stacked in corners, routines loosened. Daniel and I didn't announce anything. We didn't need to. We signed the new lease quietly, further out, closer to trees than traffic, a place where evenings ended with crickets instead of notifications. I closed the old accounts, changed passwords, and untangled my finances for good. The relief was physical, like standing up after sitting too long. Bethany didn't resurface in the way she used to. No emergencies, no demands, no dramatic entrances. Her podcast limped along for a bit, then sputtered out when the comments slowed and the sponsors vanished. Attention is a currency that dries up fast when the story stops changing. I heard through my cousin that she re-enrolled part-time using my parents' money, that they dipped into a fund they'd always insisted didn't exist. It landed with a strange clarity. The money had never been the issue. Accountability was. My parents tried a softer approach after that, a neutral text here, a careful voicemail there. No apologies, just updates, like weather reports meant to sound harmless. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because every reply used to become an invitation for negotiation, and I was done negotiating my boundaries. Silence, it turns out, can be a complete sentence. Daniel noticed the difference before I did. He said I wasn't scanning rooms anymore, wasn't preemptively planning for crises that hadn't happened yet. I laughed when he said it, then realized he was right. The hypervigilance had been a job I didn't know I'd been hired for, and I'd finally quit. We filled the evenings with ordinary things: cooking, reading, planning trips that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. We talked about projects we'd put off because we were always rescuing something that didn't want to be saved. The wedding stopped coming up, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defined the present. It was a fracture, not a destiny. Sometimes, late at night, I'd remember the sound of glass breaking, the cake collapsing, my mother's arms closing around Bethany while the room froze. The memory still stung, but it didn't steer me anymore. It was a lesson filed away where it belonged. On a quiet Sunday, my father called about a mechanic. Just a question, practical and small. I answered, gave him the number, and ended the call without commentary. There was no argument, no guilt, no attempt to reopen anything. It was oddly peaceful, like discovering a new way to exist that didn't require permission. I don't know what Bethany believes now. I don't know if my parents ever told her the truth in words they couldn't soften. What I do know is that the old dynamic doesn't reach me anymore. The net is gone. The expectation that I'll catch everyone has finally dissolved. If something falls now, it falls where it lands. Daniel and I sit on the porch most nights, cheap wine and mismatched glasses, watching the light change. We talk about what we want, not what we owe. The future feels unclaimed in the best way, open without being threatening. I used to think standing up for myself would cost me everything. It turns out it gave me back my life. Some fires don't need water. They need distance. They need time to burn through their own fuel until there's nothing left but ash and quiet. I didn't win by fighting. I won by leaving.